Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and the subject is Remaking the Urban State in India. On 2nd April, Tuesday at 3 o'clock, a seminar again by Mr. Prosenjit Tribhuvan of the University of Delhi is going to speak on marijuana, police and culture, reflections from fieldwork in the Parvati Valley, Himachal Pradesh. We have many more engagements after that, but these are the 5-6 announcements that I am making here. Just to request you that if you find time, do attend them. They are always useful. That is my experience. Having said that, before I request Rohit to deliver the talk, I must say a few words that Africa is, although we have been since independence talking about Afro-Asian solidarity, Africa has not been figuring very much in our reckoning. Africa is very distant from most of the Indians. And we are very fortunate to have a young scholar on Africa. I was reading his short bio note here, and I find that he actually trained as a geographer, and he has done his PhD from Ohio State University. Is it so? Ohio State University. He has done his PhD from, and at the moment he is assistant professor in the School of Human Ecology at Ambedkar University, Delhi. There are several universities with the name Ambedkar. That's why it has to be clarified. It is from Delhi. There is one, just now my friend informed me, there is one in Lucknow, another in where? Noida, and this is in Delhi. The three universities with the same name, more or less. Maybe slight changes there. And the synopsis that I read, I found it is very interesting. So I look forward to listen to him. And since he is looking at Africa not in a very conventional way of only trade relations, he's trying to understand through his experience and study in Zambia about the copper mining and things like this, and putting it in larger frame of the African political economy. I think it will be very interesting, and let's listen to him. I request him to kindly do his job within 40-45 minutes so that we can get some more time for discussion. Over to Rohit.
Thank you so much, sir. It's an honor to be here at Negi Memorial and present. I'll just dive into it. It's already getting late. So, to begin, what's going on right now, one of the more interesting things about the world today is this change in discourse, this sort of sudden change in discourse around Africa over the last 10-15 years. If you were to pick up a sample of articles from any sort of news magazine or even academic journals over 1990s, most of the things you would find would be about state failure, things like state failure, about pandemics like HIV, AIDS, poverty, and so on and so forth. But suddenly, now you find more and more literature on and accounts of the supposed sort of African century, or as to time and use, and The Economist, obviously one borrowed the title from the other, Africa is supposed to be rising. And this is partly a result of these growth rates, GDP per capita, and also proliferation of consumables all across the continent. So these are some of the things that are cited as far as Africa rising is concerned. But what I want to do today here is look at the story of Africa rising through a particular vantage point, through a particular locale that sort of is caught in the middle of it all. Right, and this is to sort of marginal area to even national and global state and economy. This is part of what is called the North-Western province in the southern African country of Zambia. And in particular, within that province, I'm going to be looking at Sulawesi district. Now, what we need to know about Sulawesi is that it was a district headquarter, it was a provincial headquarter. Mostly what in Africa is called a Boma town. It's an administrative town with not much of other economic activities going on. But in the 2000s, that is in the last 15 years, 2 large copper mines have opened in this area. One is, both mentioned there actually, one is just by the Valley town, called Consumption. That's called Consumption. And the other is called Lumbwana. And that entire sort of shaded area to the west, towards the west, that's the mining lease of the Lumbwana copper mine. So this is the locale, this is the place through which we're going to talk about the larger story. But also I want to see how this place has changed as a result of what is going on around in the country, around the world. And I'm going to try to do that through three sorts of parts to the presentation. So the first sort of sketches out in very broad strokes what's going on globally in terms of particularly the mining sector. Because that's what is absolutely central to a lot of changes going on, not only in Zambia and in this locality, but also all across the continent. And of course, I'm going to look at some of the experiences at this so-called frontier of capitalism that has emerged today in the last decade or so. But at the same time, within this local, global sort of intersection, we can never get away from national either. Because demands for autonomy, demands for resources and redistribution of resources and incomes often reaches to the national state, and that's where a number of these debates are held. This, by the way, is just a board that you find on entry to Sulwesi town, right? So people there obviously have a sense of the fact that they, having been largely, as I said, marginal to the state and economy, are now in the middle of it all, right? Where it is all happening. Now, as regards to the millennium economic boom that the Economist is referring to, this is from the Economist. You can see how a number of countries in Africa have witnessed high growth rates over the last 10 years. And the first half of the previous decade saw countries like Sudan, Angola, Nigeria, that is heavily oil-dependent economies, reach high growth rates, which even led someone like James Ferguson, anthropologist James Ferguson, to suggest that there was something to do with civil war and resource struggle and contemporary capitalism. Right? So he was looking at that sort of correlation. But over the second half of the decade, after Ferguson wrote his piece, that growth has also moved to countries which are more or less politically stable, which have some form of functioning democracy, and even multi-party sort of electoral framework. So that would include countries like Tanzania, Zambia, Ghana, and so on. Right, so what we see now is both sorts of economies, the ones where you had civil war and resource struggles over the past 20 or 30 years, and also ones which didn't see that sort of conflict, both are growing in terms of economic indicators. That is reflected very briefly, resource stuff you can get anywhere if you just Google. Of the countries that are growing most rapidly now, several of these countries are in Africa. So alongside India and China, now we have Tanzania, Angola, Ivory Coast, even though lately it's been mired in civil war, Kenya, Nigeria, and so on. But what remains a sticking point, I guess, and for me today a point of departure, is the fact that a lot of this new growth still comes from the same sorts of things that it has always come from. That is resources, that is primary sector, that is extractive industry. According to McKinsey, between 2002 and 2007, and indications are that things haven't changed radically since then, about a third of the total GDP, either directly or in terms of government spending from resources, comes from these extractive industries. So then these raise two sorts of issues for critical analysis. One is what I sort of put in scare quotes, unless manufacturing grows. So there is a whole debate amongst economists particularly that unless manufacturing sector also grows within Africa, you won't have the sort of long-term developmental transition that we have seen in countries of East Asia, countries that are now known as the Asian tigers. However, my problem, I don't have any problem with it per se, but the problem in terms of analysis is that it seems that it doesn't account for a lot of what is going on. It's more focused on what is absent from the place. Right? So I still want to retain a focus on resources, on extraction. But within that, there is the so-called resource curse framework. People may have heard about this term, where the idea is that Well, essentially, countries, places that are dependent disproportionately on extractive industries tend to remain underdeveloped, or even at worst go towards some form of state failure because of several issues. One is environmental degradation and scarcity. Then there is the Dutch disease, so-called Dutch disease, that is if foreign exchange is coming in through either aid or through resource extraction, and then that depresses other sectors of the economy, and particularly manufacturing, because exchange rates are artificially high. And then there is the idea that extraction does not need a whole host of infrastructural changes in order to perform. Right? All you need often, and this is also what is known as the Angola model, it doesn't even have to come to the ground, to the land. It can merely be positioned offshore, expatriates will work, stuff will be exported out, whoever controls that area will be given a part of that. So as a result of all of these, there is a resource curse argument. But again, my point of response is that we need to go beyond this. Right? That is sets the framework for what's going on, a canvas for sorts of things that are going on. But it seems it doesn't account for differences between places. Right? So for instance, just if you cross the border from Sulawesi to Congo, and that is only 10 to 15 kilometers from Sulawesi town, you would enter a vastly different landscape of mining, of resource extraction, of benefits from all of this. Even though the two countries have a very common shared, not only geology but also history of mining. Right? So resource curse doesn't really account for these sorts of particularities, differences. And it also makes it seem like your story is already written. Right? So no matter who you are, where you are, it's going to go down. You're going to end up in the dumps. So on both of these accounts, one, I still want to emphasize and look at the resources sector because it's just still very important. And secondly, I want to go beyond the resource curse argument, look at what may be happening in these localities and in these countries that may still be giving shape to how outcomes emerge. But in order to do so, and I'll try to be very fast with this, although it's quite fascinating, we have to actually leave Africa and re-emerge in Australia. Right, so what's going on in Australia today, or historically, is that that's another place that has been not dependent entirely, but has a very, very strong mining sector. Right, even today, a quarter of all Australian exports are from its mining, despite all the diversification and everything else that's going on in that country. And as a result, Australian expertise in mining is also sought after the world over. Right, they have some of the best geologists, engineers, contracting agencies, and so on. And some of the national heroes also are these people who prospected, who discovered new mines. Right? So this is Ernest Henry. And there is a mine, copper mine in Queensland that is named after him. But what's important for us is that it was discovered, quote unquote, in the early 90s by two geologists, Bruce Nisbet and Craig Williams, who later went on to open a company called Equinox. So two explorers opened this company focused on exploration. And in fact, in 1994, as a result of this discovery, they even won the Prospector of the Year award in Australia. How they connect to our story is that they are engaged by a large mining conglomerate called Anglo-American, which owns even De Beers. And they are brought to the Central African copper belt. Right, so this is where they are brought to prospect for copper. Right, to explore, to see whether there were any more copper reserves that could be exploited profitably. So they land up here in Central Africa looking, exploring. Right, and this region, as I said already, has a long history of mining since the early 20th century. The British ruled over Zambia, or what was then Northern Rhodesia. The Belgians ruled over Congo. And so this history has long engagement with mining. And the conventional wisdom was that all the mines, all the copper that was of high grade, and there is a lot of copper of high grade in this region, was already known, was already discovered, and was already mined, or at least the leases were owned by someone or the other. But Equinox managed to find a piece of land with a lot of reserves, although of lower grade. Right? But which did not interest Anglo-American too much. So Anglo-American sort of disbanded the entire process. But Equinox still remained in Zambia. Instead, so now we're talking about mid-1990s. What they did instead, they found another piece of property and negotiated with an American company called Self-Storage, another huge mining enterprise. And they managed to buy a lease that they had for $5 million. Right? They managed to buy this in $5 million early 2000s. And according to Greg Williams, this is still his most prized possession. That is the receipt that he got from Self-Storage when he bought over this piece of property. Now what's going on is in this time, so now we are moving towards early 2000s, is that after several decades of very low prices, copper prices, suddenly after 2004, there is this upward movement in prices. To such an extent that within 6-7 years, they reached unprecedented record levels, about $4.5 to a pound, from between hovering around $1.5 to a pound. Now just to give some reference, large-scale open-pit copper mine usually works at about $1.2 a pound in terms of the cost. So as soon as it moves above that, you have this capital moving in, investments coming in, people prospecting. You suddenly there is a circle that emerges in certain places as soon as that happens. And so by 2004, Equinox has this lease in pocket and is now going out in the world asking banks and other agencies to give them money to build this copper mine. It's not easy, and I talked to Craig Williams, Steve and everyone, who said it wasn't easy. Partly because what happened in the late 90s was that there was a huge scam, many people have heard about it, the BX scam. That is, there are Canadian mining company faked gold reserves in Indonesia and raised $6 billion from the world market. But of course, there was no reserve at all. So companies by now, banks and lenders are very hesitant to back new companies, smaller entrants into the sector, which is what Equinox was. Still, by 2006, they managed to raise $800 million to construct this mine in Sulawesi. Right? And in 2009, they finally commissioned the mine after this whole investment. But by then, what has happened now is that copper prices are very high, and these companies are making huge loads of money as a result of all of this. And the prices are so high, just to give a perspective, that such tailings or the waste from copper mining that took place in the 50s and 60s, they have also become a resource now. So companies are looking to buy the old waste and reprocess it to produce copper out of it. Meanwhile, the gold prices around the world are also similarly through the roof. You all know this story much better. One result is that a company called Barrick, which is the largest gold producer in the world, it has increased its profits, its operating capital over 4-5 times during the same period. Right? So what we have by 2010-2011 is that record prices, lots of profit that have been realized, and now there is all this capital, big companies that are looking to invest elsewhere, that are looking to pick up assets all over the place. Right? And this is when Equinox becomes a target for a number of hostiles or takeovers. First, this was a Chinese-owned company that tried to take it over for $6 billion. Did not succeed. But Barrick finally managed to buy Equinox in 2011. But while it was doing so, while this negotiation was going on, this is the first part of 2011, again, prices are at their highest ever. Right? So they managed to get a great deal. And in the end, Lumwana or Equinox gets bought over Barrick for $8 billion. So the people who have held on to this Equinox shares from 2001 realized 15,000 times profit on the same. Right? So this proves it's not just IT or software that they have realized so much profit in the last 50 years. It's also entire mining scenario over the world. And in all of this, Craig Williams has become a star of mining all over the world. Right? Whatever he does now is taken very seriously. In fact, you can, on May 4th, I believe, you can even hear him speak right in Sydney. Anyway, so all these things are going on. Capital is floating all around the world, looking for places to invest in, and this is where the place that we were talking about, the ethnographic site, that is Sulawesi, becomes the center of the changed economic climate around the world. So the question is, what are people making of it within Zambia? So what's going on there? Zambia is sort of coming down, narrowing down the focus to the state. Now the country over the last 7-8 years has consistently had high growth rates. To the extent that their per capita income has also increased over 3 times. They multiplied their per capita income by a factor of 3 over just 8 or 9 years. And in fact they've gone therefore from a lower income category to a lower middle income category, so whatever that's worth. But people realize though, within Zambia, that their fate still is tied to the global prices of the same commodity, copper. Right? So in Zambia, 3/4 of their export income is just on account of copper. Still 30% of their overall GDP is on account of copper. Right? So they realize that, and that's why at the lowest point when the housing crash happened in the US, the prices went down for a little bit. This is where you find an editorial in the Post. It's a fantastic newspaper in Zambia called the Post. And so it writes an editorial at that moment when prices have gone down. And they say Zambia is the tip of the tail of the global dog. So when the dog is happy, we find ourselves flicking from side to side. When the dog is miserable, we find ourselves coiled up and down to the side. So people realize that there may be similar sorts of processes, similar sorts of material reasons for the sort of growth that they are seeing. But there certainly still are some differences. Right? So the poverty rate has actually declined. It's not very, very substantially, but at least in some measure. Between 96 and 2010, 96 was the middle of what is known as the lost decade, that is 19, often called the lost decade in Africa. Life expectancy has increased over the same period, both in Zambia and elsewhere. And to the extent that taxes are low, they still gain much more revenues from mining than they used to previously. But of course, you have to put it in perspective, because the mine consultancy that also is in Sulawesi district. In one country, in 1 year alone, it managed $1.7 billion, which is more than double the entire tax revenues from mining that the entire country got. But they are still going on. Things are changing in Zambia, and so going into too much details, what's happened lately is that there is some measure of political stability, not only in Zambia but also several other countries in Africa. There has happened what is known as debt relief. That is, earlier interest payments that were going to World Bank and other international agencies, those were waived in 2000s as a result of the highly indebted poor country initiative, the HIPC initiative. So more money that is now raised from taxes is retained within the country for other sorts of spending. You also have a very, very vocal and very organized workforce, particularly in Zambia. Throughout Zambian history, unions have been very, very strong in the country. And despite all the waves of contractualization, casualization, they still remain very vocal and organized and connected to larger politics within the country. And this is, again, not just unique to Zambia. Right? This is also more common. And as a result, as a perhaps unintended or intended consequence of this sort of democratization pushed by the international agencies in the 90s, what has happened now is that there is a vibrancy of society. There are newspapers, there are organizations of various kinds, transnational, national, local, that constantly seek to push the state towards more redistributive sorts of mechanisms of dealing with the revenues from mining. Right? So, while resources still remain the backbone, circumstances have significantly changed now as regards to definitely colonial times, but also 70s, 80s and 90s. Things are very, very different, and there are large-scale and very vocal and organized demands now against the sort of very lopsided agreements that were signed with mining companies during the waves of privatization in the 90s. So all of this is going on within the national level debate. Right, and in 2008, in fact, as a response to all of this within Zambia, the government of the country actually brought in a new legislation that changed the tax rate entirely of the mining companies. That were to apply to mining companies. So they increased royalties, introduced a new windfall tax, and so on. So things are changing in this period. But the third sort of place that we want to look at from which actually is to do with a lot of, which is behind a lot of the changes and where in fact mining capital actually spatializes, is the frontier, is the place at the middle of it all. Now what I want to do here is just look at how the transformation of this place as a result of mining actually has created different sorts of ideas about future, about people's expectations from the change, and how they lead to certain sorts of political action. So that is the idea. Now, as anthropologist Anna Singh says, a lot of, particularly in mining but also in other sectors, you have to sell dreams before, many years before you realize the actual fruits of those dreams. Right? So you have to sell a story, you have to sell an idea. And that's what Greg Williams also says. He says it took persistence and good story to build a giant mine. The CEO also says how this copper mine that came into this hitherto sort of neglected part of the country brings a measure of prosperity to areas which would otherwise have little prospect of escaping from poverty. Right? So there is a notion, there is an idea of depth, of time, of solidity that this mine sort of performs in this area. And that's the sort of message it gives out to people in this area. And to some extent it is also bought by people because look, it's gone from a bush to an entire new town within a space of 6 years. Right? So these sort of changes in space are linked to people's ideas about the future. About what, again, James Ferguson calls the expectations of modernity. Right? And that's also he was writing in the context of Zambia. And here is an individual who's looking for a job on the mine. Right? And according to him, Lumbana, this copper mine, is a company which will make Zambia a real Zambia. Right? It will bring quick development. So friends, see here is how these ideas of and performance of copper mining and transformation of space are linked to people's ideas about themselves, about the future. And there is a discourse of modernity, of development that is part of this story. And through which people make sense of the changes. This is also seen in a cover page for a magazine which shows how this street on the left, which is called Cairo Road in Lusaka, Zambia, how as a result of what is going on, in particular as a result of Chinese investment in their story, it's going to resemble something else entirely. And these markers that you will see on the right are sort of the images you associate with the first world which developed it and so on. There are these ideas about modernity, about expectations that I'm working with in the paper. And in this, the actual physical presence of the mine and machinery and artifacts of mine, those are absolutely central to the story. Right, so for instance, Rogers, in talking about oil extraction in Russia, says how materiality or the sensuous and phenomenal quality of things and their have implications in human social and cultural life. Right? And how machinery, how material, and how artifacts also have something to do with how we perceive our immediate world and therefore act upon it. Just illustration, this truck there are several such, 70 such trucks now in this copper mine. Now each tire, by the way, to scale these are massive, right? Each tire has a diameter of 5 meters. Right? They consume a whole lot of diesel. Often they are also connected to electric grids and so on. But what's interesting is that any time you would go to the mine with any Zambian citizen, or in this case, the provincial minister, everyone is absolutely fascinated by this truck, and everyone has to get this photograph taken with the car. And this is a ritual that happens all the time, and again and again. And this is one time where you see there's a group of bureaucrats with the minister visiting this copper mine, and he's showing around, and they're getting the pictures taken with this piece of machinery. It is as if it symbolizes something big, something massive, very enormous, an investment in the state, investment in that part of the world. On the other hand, there is this piece of machinery which is called the ball mill, which processes the ore. So one of the parts of the processing of the ore, the ball mill. What's interesting is that in 2007-8, as the Mana is being constructed, this huge mine worth $1 billion being constructed, they're bringing the machinery to the place from South Africa. So the ports of South Africa are the routes they take to Zambia. Now the itinerary of the ball mill, however, was broadcast on radio before it would get there, and there will be people lined up all around Sulawesi, all around the town, looking at this piece of machinery. Right, and talking about sort of just in awe of what's going on. And again, the mining is machinery sort of interacting or intersecting with people's ideas about or experiences of what's going on. Then there is the idea which is very popular in Zambia. There is a part of the country which is called the line of rail, which is there's a railway that extends from all the way Livingston in the south and then further south to Harare and further south to South Africa, and all the way up, which divides the country into two. So it goes to the northern mining towns. Those are all old mining towns, and those are the ones and so on. And then it goes further up into Congo. Now in Zambian history, this is also the area which is much more developed than the rest of the country. So the farther you move from the line of rail, the more poor, the more sort of subsistence-oriented economy it will become. Now in 2007, it was also announced that Sulawesi would be now connected to the line of rail, thus leading to all sorts of ideas again amongst people. Everyone would be excited by it. It was reported everywhere. Everyone was talking about it. In any meeting you went to, the first mention would be now will be connected to the line of rail. Then while all this was going on, the first proper hotel comes up in Sulawesi also. Right? So it's called the Royal Sulawesi Hotel. It's a secondary shoe open South African country. But again, now Sulawesi is in the map of the entire country. Earlier, there was hardly any guest houses. One had to stay even actually in Catholic diocese or some place like that. But now there's a proper hotel in Sulawesi. There was also now a ShopRite, which if you visited Southern Africa, it's a chain, South African chain, which is everywhere, but not in villages, not in Boma towns. It is where things are happening. Right? So ShopRite opens in Sulawesi, and it becomes immediately what the Veneman described as circus. There's not only are people buying and selling commodities, but there's also other things going on there. Right? So there are women who would go inside the bakery of ShopRite, would buy the bread, queuing up inside, therefore making it impossible for anyone else to go in and get bread, but then outside selling those 4 or 5 pieces of loaves for a little bit of markup. There are also some other things going on there too. And the through ShopRite, through being one of only 4 or 5 places in the country that had a ShopRite, so really people living here were now also participating in sort of the wider community of consumption, of being connected to global capitalism, to global systems. And that was most painfully or visibly manifest one morning when the store burned as a result of what was supposedly a short circuit, or according to some people, a sabotage. So the store burned, but interestingly again, as the inward is still alive for 4-5 days, people were just crowding around the ShopRite, just looking at it being burned, as if something more than just the building was just going up in smoke, and also reinforcing how their own connections to that wider community that I just mentioned were also somewhat tenuous. But more and more you find there being this, while there are these expectations definitely of development, of modernity, of the coming future, which is only now just being made visible, there are also this emerging gap between that and the everyday life, people's everyday life. So this photograph actually shows a golf course that the copper mine has built. And in the background is the entire town. So pretty much about 10,000 people live in the same piece of land that the golf course is made on. And it is visible to all, it is seen by all, and of course entry is restricted to only the managers of the mine or their visitors. According to a union activist, the mine is creating, quote unquote, another Cape Town in Sulawesi. So by Cape Town, they are sort of bringing back the ideas of apartheid, ideas of exclusive places. And also because a lot of the contractors on the mine and expatriates on the mine are South Africans, are white South Africans. And we see now at a lot of, I've written about it in another paper, how in lots of these different engagements around a town where the mining company meets the state and the people, you have these sort of spontaneous eruptions of displeasure, of dissatisfaction, of the idea that, look, we've moved here, but what have we got out of it? Right? Money is coming in, but there's very little to show for it. And this is one such very unlikely place where such a spontaneous thing happens. This is during a youth day parade. But there is a youth day in Zambia. It's also a very institutionalized sort of state bureaucratic thing where the ministers come and make speeches, very boring speeches about how tomorrow belongs to the youth, which of course means today belongs to us. Right? And then you should do this and that and so on. And all the schools, all the institutions, government, wherever government money goes, basically, they have to be part of this march past. Except that there was a group of these guys, 8 or 10 of them, they just cobbled together a piece of cardboard and wrote unemployed youth of Sulawesi. And they were walking along in the youth march past as well, sort of critiquing that entire discourse that has just been going on around them. There's even a band playing as they march. And sometimes this action is also sort of direct. So here there is a whole category of political agents in Southern Africa, Central Africa that are known as marketeers. Marketeers, and mostly these are women. These are either people in the informal markets in the cities, or these are women who get up early in the morning, buy some stuff from different parts or maybe from another part of the country, bring it back, sell things out in the street and then go back home. So they are a very good constituency and also very organized. And they embark on certain sorts of symbolic but also some direct actions. Here they are, they were given some piece of land, they were removed from the road, it had to be widened. They were given a piece of land out in the middle of nowhere by the municipality. And these sort of markers of the plots were erected, and one day just bent. They broke the whole thing down and they set fire to it. Right? They were refusing to leave this place, refusing to give that space up for that larger road, for the larger highway that was supposed to now connect them even more closely with the rest of the world. What's also interesting, just a couple of things more, is how all of these things, now if we generalize what's going on, so there is global capital that sort of funnels down to these localities where people move in, and there are these expectations of development, modernity, but also dissatisfactions around them. If you generalize and look at it in terms of the entire nation state or the state of Zambia, then you find these sorts of things going on in several different localities, and amongst different groups of people. Right? So, like I said, there is a rising dissatisfaction against the whole trajectory of privatization and post-privatization economy. And interesting in Zambia is that there is this person called Michael Sata, also known, his moniker is King Cobra. He is known as the King Cobra. Previous president who he contested elections against was known as Cabbage. So one election they had Cabbage versus King Cobra. That was 2006. Now he is an interesting character because he has come from outside of the political discourse, and he has sought to bring together or articulate many different sorts of platforms or demands against the trajectory of the economy. So there is the unionized workforce which is being contracted, which is facing all sorts of problems. There are the so-called youth that are also outside of the established networks, but who are also very politically vocal. Then there are the marketeers from everywhere. And in Zambian case, as also in several other African cases, there are different church organizations, not only the Catholic, but also Pentecostal and other churches. Huge constituencies and very organized constituencies. What he's managed to do is he's managed to bring them together under this platform, at first, anti-China platform. So marketeers are unhappy with China because Chinese people are coming into the market selling eggplants when they said Zambians quote-unquote were fully capable of doing that job. Workers already have been having a lot of conflicts in Chinese-owned firms, and so have church groups and so on. So he brought all of them together. He contested 2006 presidential election on that platform of anti-China. And he managed to go from 2% of the vote in 2001. 2006 he managed to get 28% of the vote. 2008 he got 43% of the vote. So from 2 to 43% over the 6 years. And so I'm sort of interpreting it in sort of populist terms. How these disparate positions and demands are being given a common platform, a shared antagonism, right? So China in one instance, but more broadly the sort of foreign control of the economy in the other. And this increasing economic nationalism is visible in Zambia. And according to Lama and Fraser, his skill is to identify that popular mood and ally himself with it, to associate with mobilizations that demonstrate popular engagement with people. You can see even within Sulawesi there are all these different sorts of groups coming, or at least united notionally by common antagonism, and definitely all over the country. And having gone from 2 to 43% in the elections in 2011, he actually managed to win the election. He is now the president of the country of Zambia. Of course, now it's a big question. What do you do about the economy now that you are in power? It's one thing to sort of critique from outside, but very different when you come into power. So one thing he has toned down his entire rhetoric against China. Because of course Chinese capital, Chinese know-how is very important for the country. But there is still a vibrant debate going on within Zambia as to what should be done next. And in particular, I just mentioned the Post, the newspaper. That's been very anti-establishment over a long time. But now they are also sort of doubting themselves because they've been aligned therefore with Michael Sata and his party. And now they are sort of questioning what do we now that he's in power. Should we give them a long rope and see how they change things or try to change things, or should we continue to critique them and so on. Point being that there is now a large-scale shift in politics as a result of grassroots, of experiences, of action, but also of national level political space that has been created for civil society, for the press, for other political parties. And that, in the last instance, is what is going to shape the sorts of futures that emerge in Africa. And not so much as is usually the discourse in India, that India should do this, China should do that, we should be benevolent or not. So my argument is that it's not so much that, but rather how things are changing within and what political positions emerge that is going to change things in Africa and London. I'll just stop.
Thank you, Rohit.